Evening. Welcome to the Majors and Quinn Facebook page and YouTube channel. My name is Annie. I'm the events coordinator at Majors and Quinn Booksellers, which is an independent bookstore in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If you're not familiar with us, welcome. If this is your first virtual author event with us, thanks for being here. We're very pleased to bring this virtual author conversation to your screens. Tonight, we're speaking with Laura Munson and Julie Metz, both authors with recent titles. I'm going to introduce them both to you, and then they're each going to read a bit from their new books, and then they will have a conversation with one another. And at the very end, there will be time for a few questions. So you will do that in the comments or chat area, whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube. So absolutely also use those places to say hello. Let us know where you're watching from. But at the very end, I will come back on and take any questions that we see. That's my cat. Sorry. He's loud. But for now, let me introduce our speakers, and then I will be putting links into the chat for how you can get those books at majorsandquinn.com. You know, we're an independent bookstore, and we really appreciate you supporting us if that's where you choose to buy the books. Laura's book, Willa's Grove, is available now, so I will be dropping the link to that in the comments. And Julie's book is forthcoming in early April 6, 2021. I'll put the link to that to our website. However, you'll see that it's not quite yet available. You can always keep checking back to our website for that. Or if you would like to pre-order, you can give us a phone call, and I'll put our phone number in the comments as well. Thank you both for being here. And I am going to introduce you to these wonderful speakers right now. So Laura Munson is the New York Times bestselling author of This Is Not the Story You Think It Is, chronicles her journey through her own midlife crossroads, drawing from the striking response to her memoir, the essay version of it in the New York Times Modern Love column, and her speaking events at women's conferences across the U.S. Laura founded the acclaimed Haven Writing Retreats and Workshops. After watching over 1,000 people find their unique and essential voices under the big sky of Montana she calls home, Laura created Willa, The Invitation, The Friends, and The Town to share what she has learned with people globally. Hardcover version of Willa's Grove is USA Today bestseller, and her work has been published and featured in many media outlets throughout the world. Laura, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And we're also so excited to have Julie Metz here. Julie is the New York Times bestselling author of Perfection. She's written for publications including New York Times, Salon, Dame, Redbook, and Glamour. She's received fellowships at Yaddo, the MacDowell Colony, the Virginia Center for Creative Arts, and the Vermont Studio Center. She lives with her family and 2 cats in the Hudson Valley. And you can find her on Instagram at Julie Metz Writer and her website, juliemetz.com. Thank you both so much for being here. And have fun. I will be back in about an hour.
Okay. Thanks, Annie. Thank you so much, Annie. And thank you to Majors and Quinn booksellers. Please support this wonderful bookstore in Minneapolis, Minnesota. What a wonderful book town that the Twin Cities are both just wonderful book towns. And I also want to thank my cohort tonight and my friend and bestselling author, Julie Metz. You're about to learn a lot about her book and a lot about her process. I'm happy to have you join me tonight, Julie. And so I want to kind of give you all the lay of the land before we start. And that is that Julie and I have come up with 4 powerful questions to ask of one another about our books and also what's behind them. And we're going to braid those questions and answers together in what we hope will be an illuminating conversation. So first, we're going to tell a little bit about our books and read a short excerpt from each. And then we'll get into the discussion. It will begin. And so I'd like to go first. Because my book, it really begins with an invitation. And I think it's an invitation that also invites us into the world of Julie's book as well. So does that sound good, Julie?
That sounds great.
Okay. Here we go. Here we go. All right. So this is what writers get. It's this advanced reading copy. And this is what I was using out on the road. So it's very marked up. So I'd like to begin with the letter to the reader, which is at the end of the book. And it really talks about what the book is about. Just very quickly, if you haven't read the book or if you know nothing about it, it's a novel about 4 women who are all at a major crossroads moment in their lives. And they are all basically isolating out of shame guilt, fear of being judged, things that are so relatable to so many of us when we make bold choices in our lives and things don't work out. And they are really finally hitting breaking points and decide that they need to come together. And it's all inspired by Willa, who's the protagonist, and her dear old friend from childhood, Bliss. I'll get into that in a minute. But here's the letter to the reader. And this comes out of Bliss's mouth in the middle of the book. She says, we're all fluent in this language, in the language of community, and yet we so rarely speak it. It really is our mother tongue. I'm going to read that one more time, and I want you to really put this into your heart, especially right now with all the isolation that we've all lived through in the last year. We're all fluent in this language, in the language of community, and yet we so rarely speak it. It really is our mother tongue. And here's the letter to the reader. Dear reader, I have learned something that might just be the most important lesson of my life, and I would like to share it with you. There is a language that we crave, a language of the heart that grows from our worry and our wonder and our stories, rooted in our experience of this beautiful and heartbreaking thing called life. Too many of us have trained ourselves out of speaking that language. We were all fluent in it when we were children, but somewhere along the way we were taught or conditioned to forget it, to not be honest when we are asked, "How are you?" and to not really listen to the answer when we ask others the same question. So many of us have lost our authentic voices and reduced our conversations to grocery store talk and texts with an emoji at the end. The truth is we long to be seen and heard and accepted, especially when we are in pain. Yet, out of fear of judgment or rejection, we too often draw in and become islands rather than bridging to our family and friends. I know this because at times I've made that choice, and the fallout from that led me to devote a major piece of my life to bringing people together in safe, intimate circles of self-expression, which led me to write this book. I wrote Willa's Grove to capture the power of people stepping out of the isolation and self-doubt that so many of us feel in times of transition, and instead gathering together. These women show us that we don't have to endure hardship alone, nor should we. We have choices. If, for whatever reason, connecting with our usual community is too fraught, we can instead create temporary circles, friend to friend to friend to friend, carving out small interludes from our daily lives in order to focus on what comes next, to have those conversations we need to be having but aren't, to move boldly outside of gossip, small talk, pretending, and into the conversation and connection we so deeply need. I hope that in reading this book and in the spirit of Willa, Bliss, Harriet, and Jane, you will be inspired to reach out to your own dear friends, whether close by or far away. And that you will invite them to come together for short respites to support one another in the powerful way that people can when they give themselves permission to say yes to the profound invitations of their lives. My mission is this: we will start a movement of week-long interludes from the stresses and pain of our crossroads moments. And in radical and real communication, we will provide ourselves and our kindreds with a map for our next steps. Our voices deserve to be honored and heard. No one has your voice. No one. However we speak, now is the time for truth, especially now. And yes, we don't have to do it alone. Yours, Laura. So that is the letter to the reader. And I don't normally write a letter to the reader, but boy, am I glad I did, because never when I wrote this book could I have imagined how timely this book would be and its message, and why I'm so excited to team up with Julie, because there's so much storytelling at the root and in the blood and the veins of both of our books. So I just want to read the very beginning of the book, and then Julie will read the beginning of hers, or an excerpt from hers. So the book begins with this: the women. And as I'm reading this, I want you to imagine if you got this invitation in the mail, how would that feel for you? Would you be able to say yes to it? And this is for all of you out there. On a typical day in their typical lives, 3 women went to their mailboxes and found, amid junk mail and bills and shiny flyers for unshiny things, an invitation sealed with a bold W pressed into sage green wax. They had been waiting for this invitation. They longed for it as much as they feared it, because to break this seal was to release a behemoth of a question so impossible that they had almost stopped asking it. Each hesitated, looked around, and in respective order thought, "Sweet Jesus, what the hell? Here goes nothing," and slid her finger under the seal, revealing a thick handmade note card pressed with silvery leaves. Words winked up at them, words that might, if given the chance, change everything. They swallowed and pulled out the card. Inside, nestled with a wild bird feather, were the following words. This is the invitation. You are invited to the rest of your life. You know you can't go on like this. Not for one more day. You need an interlude. Imagine this. You are in a farmhouse in Montana, wrapped in a soft blanket, sitting by a warm wood stove. There's a cup of tea in your hand, just the way you like it. There are women surrounding you who need this just as badly as you do. We all have the same question. The question is, so now what? Come to Montana and find out. Love, Willa. You don't have to do this alone. Each woman held the invitation to her heart, drew in a deep breath before letting out an exhausted sigh that echoed from Connecticut to Wisconsin to California and back to Montana, and went inside to call a dear friend. So that's how the book begins. And it's so interesting because Julie's book is a memoir with and we'll learn later, some fictional pieces in it. I'm known for memoir, and yet the fiction is probably my truest love. The parallels are so big. And what I love about the beginning of Julie's book is that there's a sacred kind of finding in it. I hope you read from that tonight.
Yeah.
That's really similar. It's when people get into creating our longing and turning it into something that's sacred that we can hold in our hands, that things change. So Julie, why don't you read the beginning or whatever you want to read from your beautiful book?
Thank you so much. And I'm glad to be here. So I'm going to read from the opening. But before I do that, I'll just say that this was a book in which there are, as Laura points out, there are sort of some special objects. And one of them was a keepsake book that I found that had been my mom's. After she died, we found it in the back of a drawer. She'd kept it there for over 5 decades. She'd never shown it to any of us, not anyone in the family. And then one of the things that I always bring a little demonstration is that you'll hear me describe an object that my grandfather made in his factory that I refer to as the paper fan. And this was a patented piece of many papers glued together, folded in this kind of lovely origami way. I'm just nuts about this thing. I just love showing it. Anyway, before pills came in the, I guess in the 30s, in the 1930s, they started to become common in use. Medicine was dispensed as powder, and this little object was used to package powdered medicine. The importance of it is that my mother always said that this was the object that saved her father's life. So I'll leave you with that. And then I will just place this photo. Well, actually, Laura, maybe I will have you do that because it didn't quite get the screen's a different shape. So I'll read just from the prologue. And the title of the prologue is Ava at 9. And this photograph that Laura has up here is a photograph.
I'll get it here in a minute. It's the It's everything's opposite. It's the opposite day over
Yeah,
here. Okay,
I know it's a
wait.
little
Here we go.
tricky.
There we
Okay,
go.
there you
Okay,
go.
there it is.
So that's my mother, who was 9 years old in January 1938 when that photograph was taken. And now I will begin at the beginning. Ava at 9. I've never met this sweet child who smiles at me with the confidence of a well-loved daughter. She is pretty, well-groomed, well-fed. She poses on her own in a comfortable sitting room, but in her easy gaze, I sense the presence of other people: parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends, and the unknown photographer. Behind her, a few hints of the room's decor: rounded backrest of an elegant wooden chair, sideboard decorated with a lacy cloth, door framed in carved molding against a patterned wallpaper, all recede in layers of gauzy focus. What is it about this girl? She seems at once so innocent, yet so knowing. Her plump cheeks are incarnadine, like a morsel of blush-tinted marzipan. Yet something about the intensity of her dark eyes tells me she is fiercer than her sweet presentation. She will need that fierceness. In 2 months, this girl's country will be taken over by a cohort of extremists led by an authoritarian germaphobe who hates people of her kind. He sees them as filth, vermin, contamination. In truth, there have always been people in her country who hated her ethnic group, but now their views will be fully validated and normalized. In 6 months, this well-appointed sitting room will be ransacked, and most of the remaining possessions that aren't shattered or stolen by an emboldened police force will be sold off so that the family can survive for the next 2 years. The girl's parents will spend those 2 years in a struggle against a mighty bureaucracy as they attempt to get out of a once beloved city whose majority population now sees them as enemies of a new empire. Having lost all rights, the family will now be stateless. Across the ocean, the latest incarnation of the xenophobic, isolationist America First movement is in full sway. Immigrants are suspect, even those who have thrown off most of their traditional customs in an effort to assimilate, to become Americans. The girl looks at me intently, and I meet her gaze. 80 years have passed since a camera captured her face in the midst of a gentle winter afternoon. Now the gyres of history have revolved. Promoted by another would-be authoritarian and obsessive hand washer, America First is back, emblazoned on posters, t-shirts, and red baseball caps. I flip the photograph. On the reverse side, a diligent family archivist has written January 1938 in soft pencil. The 9-year-old girl in the frilly dress lived in Vienna, Austria, where a world of safety and comfort was about to end. Her name was Ava, and she was my mother. I knew her as Eve. On the winter mornings of my childhood, crystalline waves of frozen condensation would cover the window panes of our city apartment like lichen on a rock, blocking the street 6 floors below. When I pressed a warm fingertip to the frost, a tiny clearing appeared, like the porthole of a miniature ship. If I made enough of these port ovals, I could begin to make out a wavy image of the street through the veil of melted ice. This for me is the challenge of memory and memoir writing. We create small vistas from what we remember, and if we can create enough of them, we can begin to piece together a story from what we see. But the vistas, like those my fingers made in the frost, can close up again. They might very well remain sealed for a lifetime. When I first found a keepsake book way back in the back of my mother's lingerie drawer, I thought I was looking only at a sentimental artifact from her childhood, something about which I knew too little. Later, I remembered a high school history teacher who had pressed us students to consider the political, economic, and social implications of whichever event we were examining in class. To that end, I had subconsciously started thawing small portals long before I even understood that the keepsake book was part of something larger than my mother's childhood or our family history. It would take years and a political sea change for me to fully unravel its meaning. My mother's keepsake book felt like a challenge, as if she were asking me to tell our family's story to those people of her adopted country, people who may have forgotten that we are a nation of both adventurers and reluctant refugees, that there could be quiet greatness in following one woman's journey from one name to another, from Ava to Eve. And thank you. Oh, I've lost audio again. I've lost audio.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank
That
you.
was so powerful. I mean, holding it up, sorry about the kind of wavering back and forth, but it was just to hold up that person who went through that strife and to shine a light on her for even just the time that you read about it, and then to think about just the experience of what it is to read the book. It's a beautiful book. I hope you all pre-order it and order it, read it, love it the way I have. So, Julie, let's start with you. I'd like to, since we're hot on the topic of your beautiful book, I'd like to ask you the first question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so the question I'd like to ask is, so both of our books have strong storytelling themes, and some stories are true and some are myth, especially in families when they're passed on from generation to generation.
Mm-hmm.
And I would love for you to speak about the role of memory and storytelling in your memoir.
Yeah, so I think, it's true. I think whether it's a novel or a memoir, there's stories. And my mother had her stories. She didn't tell us very much about her childhood. So a lot of the work that I did was really trying to sort of dive into those stories, do as much research as I could to find out how much, how many of her stories were true and where there might be some fuzzy memories or unreliable narrators, or just that type of myth making that happens in every family. You have stories, especially with people who escaped the Holocaust. There's quite a lot of that myth making because the stories really are, I would say, any family that did get out in time, there's always something kind of unbelievable that happened, whether it was, luck or just being at the right place at the right time. There was a lot of that. And so I really had to sort of sift through that. My mother did give an interview at one point to an institute, and the descriptions, the way she told the stories was so much the way I remembered that in the book I used a lot of her words, just verbatim from her interview. So I felt like I couldn't improve on her voice, and I wanted her voice to appear. So it was, yeah. So, yeah. And then I think we'll move on to a question for you. Yeah.
I would love that. But I also, just while we're on the subject, help us, give us some advice if we have family members that are still with us,
Mm-hmm.
and we could ask those questions, even if they deliver the answers as myth and like kind of magical thinking. How would you advise us to approach our elders? Because certainly none of us wants to have a regret. But without that propelling us, really, just what's the value of asking our elders the stories, and what would you advise us to do in that way?
Well, I am sorry that I wasn't sort of bold enough and brave enough to ask my mother more when she was living, but a lot of that had to do with the nature of our relationship that had a lot of conflict in it. and also just that she had been so clearly resistant during her life to sharing more than a few stories. Some of them actually, one of the famous family stories about the escape is actually quite comic and absurd. So there was sort of, I guess, gallows humor present as well. But these were her stories. I would say if you have older families living, now is the time. And there's ways, I think I've tried to do this with my dad. I didn't want to make the same mistake. And my dad, who's 95, he all his memories have to do with food and eating, and his memories of childhood, because he grew up in the Depression, are often about not eating. So I found that the best thing to do was to take him to lunch and turn on the recorder and just let him talk. And somehow it would all evolve from just these meals that we had. So there were a lot of lunches, and I have many hours of his stories about fighting in World War II as a young soldier, and I could write a whole other book just about my dad. But it's so yes, I would say try to engage your family members now and save those stories, because they are important. They're your inheritance. So yeah.
Thank you for that. Okay, lay it on me, Julie.
I'm laying it on. So your book, there, as you read in the introduction, you've got 4 really different kind of women. And I guess I know that readers and I am curious, sort of how you came up with these characters. Are they aspects of yourself? Are they people that you met? I was just wondering if you could talk about that and sort of tell us a bit about them as individuals and how they came to be.
I sure will. I love talking about the writing process. So even though I'm known for nonfiction, although Willa's Grove is a USA Today bestseller, fiction is truly my love. Like on the other side of this wall, there's a closet, because it's my office closet, and there are about 22 unpublished novels in there. About 8 of them are good. I've dedicated my adult life to writing fiction. And so I wanted to capture what happens at my Haven writing retreats, which we can talk about later.
Yeah.
But when people come together to, like, for the express intention to move forward in their lives and really use the written word to help them find that self-awareness that helps us to move forward in their lives. I remember sitting on my bed one morning thinking, how can I capture this in a novel? And so I wanted to write a novel that captures the magic of what happens on the Haven writing retreats. When people step outside of their comfort zones, I know you've done retreats before, and join small circles of supportive seekers, in order to find their voices and tell their stories and dig deeply into, again, their self-awareness. And especially when it happens out here in Montana, we live so close to Glacier National Park, big things happen for people. And so I didn't want to write a book about a writing retreat. I wanted to capture that magic of self-expression, whether it's spoken or written, and the importance of writing stories and sharing them and creating a safe space for that. So again, it begins with self-awareness. If we can't tap into our self-awareness, how are we ever going to be able to build a bridge to the person with whom we are expressing ourselves, whether, again, it's spoken or written? And I wanted to try to create a book that was a true novel about people learning how to do just that. So when people gather together in these intentional small groups, especially far away from home, they connect with themselves in a way that perhaps they don't know how to do at home, with the rigor and the wear of their daily lives. So this is not, again, a book about a writing retreat, although there is some writing in it. But once I started to write it, I realized that the characters needed to write the book. And so that meant that I needed to understand these characters, and they needed to have very relatable crossroads moments that were going on in their lives. So I always say that none of these characters is me, none is anyone I know, and yet they are all of us. So in getting to know these characters, I knew that I needed to go straight into their central conflicts. And I wanted to choose central conflicts that were relatable. And so I chose ones that were interesting to me. So one of the characters, and that's Bliss, is really looking at faith versus religion, which is a big one for me and for many people I know. Faith versus religion. And then the central character, Willa, the protagonist, she's really dealing with the Emersonian dream of self-reliance versus interdependence or community. Then we've got Harriet, who's got addiction to ambition. And that's something I know a lot about. I know a lot about all these things, but because of these characters and spending 9 years with them or whatever it took. And then we've got the Jane character, which is, she's really looking into, but wait a minute, I thought that money and social prestige was supposed to bring me happiness. And she's learning that it doesn't. It brings her comfort and choices, but only those two things. So, the first time I wrote the book, it was way more, it was prescriptive, I have to admit it. And then after I finished it, I thought I need to take a shower, and I'm glad I got that out, and that's good. And now I need to start again and really let the characters tell their story. And which meant that I had to go into their central conflicts and be willing to go deeply into them. So this is what I truly hoped for, that people would be able to look at these conflicts with these characters and then think about who they are because of them. And some of the things that I think about a lot when I'm developing a character, and then I can also relate it with myself, which is, what do I want? What does my character want? What's in the way of my character getting what she wants? Is she in the way of getting what she wants, which is usually the case for all of us? What does she fear? What is her central conflict? And then what would it take for her to find her way to resolve? So without going into the heart of conflict, when you are an author creating characters, how is there, and also just in our lives, how can we find resolve? So I am a big fan for going into the heart of conflict. So that's really, do they have aspects of my personality? I did not create them from other women, but I did create them from our collective, including myself. And I learned a lot from these characters once I let them tell the story. And any fiction writer will say that it's once they give it over to the characters that the characters tell the story. It sounds like woo-woo. It's not. It's even if you've got a really plot-driven book or movie or whatever it is that you're creating, it all begins with the character. So
I think that's so true. It's even writing a memoir. I never met my grandparents, but I feel like I got to know them researching their lives, and that they became characters who kind of spoke to me at times. Sounds very woo-woo, but it really does happen when you're writing. I think it's after a while your characters are sitting there next to you and telling you stories. So
yeah, and I work with a lot of people writing fiction and nonfiction in my different teachings, and they start to they'll email me and say, am I going insane? These characters are like showing up at the grocery store when I'm buying, in the green grocery section. They're like infiltrating my dreams. And no, it's not insane at all. It's that the characters, these characters come from what you care about most, your most charged themes in your life. Of course, they're going to work in your daily life. Of course, they're going to work in your subconscious. So to that end, Julie, ready for the second question?
I am ready. I'm ready.
Okay, so let's go there. So mothers and daughters, this is a complicated story for lots of people. I'd love to know what inspired you to delve into this relationship so intensively, and what advice you would have for people who feel that they need to illuminate the stories of their forebears yet resist it. So that's a little bit different than what I asked you before, which is, should you ask, the people that are still alive? So really, it's a two-part question. First one, what inspired you to delve into this relationship so intensively? The shining the light on the story of your mother being her daughter, and what you've already said that it was a difficult relationship. And then also, second part, what advice would you have for people who feel that they need to illuminate the stories of their forebears yet resist it?
Yeah, so I think it was, again, back to finding this book. The book was a little keepsake book that was filled with, sort of like an autograph book that maybe some of you all had when you were kids, and your friends would write something in it. So these were books that were very common in the 20s and 30s. There's actually archives filled with these books that girls in Germany and Austria kept. I didn't know that when I found them, when I found this one. But what I saw was that my mother this book was holding something very painful and very intense, which was that a lot of the people who wrote in that book did not get out in time, and that they were lost. And I felt like, I really did feel when I found that book that it was that my mother had left these clues behind, and that I was going to have to make sense of them somehow. And it also felt vitally important to me to really kind of make some peace and have some sense of what had really happened to my mother when she was young, when she went through all these experiences as a child, living in Nazi occupied Vienna, and to sort of understand that, so that I could hold it, but also pass it onward. I think these stories, they really are so vital. I mean, it's if you don't pass them onward and delve deeply, then they're lost forever. In my case, speaking about your characters kind of really becoming alive to you, my mother had passed away when we found this book, and I spent 6-8 years doing research and working on this book. There were many times where I felt that I was engaged in some kind of seance, and that I was, that she was pushing me along, or maybe sometimes arguing with me and telling me, I had the same feeling about of encounters with my grandparents, whom, again, as I mentioned, I never met, but I really did have that sense of sometimes them being present in the room with me, and on a couple of occasions, really almost sensing a physical presence there. And I'm a very practical person, so when I say this, I think it was really just that I felt so completely engaged with the story. And I think that if you have stories like this, family stories, they want to be told, and if you have the determination and the patience to sit with them and figure out what they mean to you, you'll find the right way to tell them. So, I mean, that might mean as a visual, that might mean a book or story of some sort, but it could mean other artistic expression. So there's lots of ways to share those stories. So,
I love what you told me before about it's like once you're onto something, you're like a dog on a bone.
yeah, no, I
Your
am.
words.
yeah, I am. It's ask my family, they'll confirm that. Yeah, once I started, I know I wasn't a trained historian, but I had to kind of become a historian. I had a lot of help, and I always want to thank the many historians who took time from their work to help me. There were institutes that helped me. People really do want to help you. So that's the other thing, is if you're researching a family story, you will find people who will be very happy to help you. People love being asked to share what they know. They really do want to share. And it's, so I sort of became, an amateur family sleuth and historian, sort of untrained, but I had to learn. So it's, yeah, so I think, well, shall we, I have a...
Yeah, I will just say, and I think we're better for it, Julie. I mean, you give us, I work with a lot of people who say, I want to write a memoir, and it involves people, because this book is not just about your mother, it's about you too.
Yeah.
And, people say, oh, I'm worried. I don't want to, like, even if that loved one is passed, I don't want to, like, tarnish his or her memory. Or if that person is still living, I don't want to expose that person. If the book is really about you and your search, which I believe that your book is, then I think that that you are being like responsible in the telling of it. And I think that that's the most important part about writing a book like this or any kind of memoir.
I mean, I will say for all people who are working on memoirs, the question everybody is worried about is that they're going to cause pain to their family members, or they're going to share some deep, dark secret. And I think the best advice I've read on this is from Anne Lamott's book, Bird by Bird, which is some version of just get it out there, write it all, pretend that everybody's dead and that nobody cares, and just write it. And later on, if you decide that there are things you need to reframe or adjust, or, you can do that. But if you don't get it all out there, then you won't have that material to work with. So it's really important to just write it all and not censor yourself. And I'm sure that is the same when you're writing a novel. You just have to get it all down there,
Yep. Get it all out. Okay, I'm ready.
Yeah, so we've talked about your characters who are in moments of transition. And I think all of us have been in these places. I mean, you get to a certain point in life and you've definitely had some experiences. It's you have children, there's divorce, deaths, people, there's all kinds of that kind of transitional space. And what I wanted to ask you about is sort of how you experienced that sort of emotionally and spiritually as you were working with your characters. I'll say working with your characters in the sense that you're almost collaborating with them or listening to your characters to tell their story. So I was just wondering how that sort of feels and how you work through that.
That's such a great question. So like two big things came up for me. I've already sort of touched on it. One was that even though it's fiction, I mean, we're all mining our lives. We're all writing characters because even if it's Stephen King writing Cujo, like a rabid dog, random illusion, but it's still of us. Everybody that we create in fiction is still somehow of us. And that's why it's so important to be aware of those central questions, the central conflicts, and the stuff that I covered in the last question. This one, if you're asking me how I personally experience this, which I think is what you're saying, I'll admit something to you, and that is that that if these characters are coming together, friend by friend by friend by friend, to Montana to answer the question, so now what, and find what's next in their lives. I mean, even though they each have at least one friend, that's still like they're out on scaffolding, that's scary. And I get to watch that every time I lead a retreat. And that's why I work so hard to create a safe space for it. Now, what that entails at a Haven writing retreat is very different than this book. This book is about these women telling each other their stories. And so it was an interesting experience for me because I knew that they had to tell their stories from the very beginning. And I knew that some of them would resist it. Like the Jane character, she's when I read earlier the letter to the reader, she's the one that's like, I'm fine, how are you? And I think we all know that person, or we all are that person sometimes. It's like, don't go too deep, please. There's too much pain there. And I think that if you're going to take the massive move to creating a retreat and then showing up for a retreat, you got to tell your story, at least in this context, right? Like at Haven, they don't tell their stories. But so at the beginning, like I said, the first draft that I wrote, they showed up just so excited and ready to go. And they got their yoga mats and they've got, and it just was false. And so So once I started to really dig into what it is to tell your story, that's when I understood the kind of refusals that we have around that. And that went straight to my heart, which is maybe what a lot of us have heard when we were little, which is you talk too much. Stop talking so much. You're so sensitive. You're so dramatic. And then if we were raised, I mean, it sounds like we were raised sort of by the same era of parents. It's like lots of like, you're seen but not heard, speak when spoken to, don't draw the spotlight. Although I fought really hard to always have the spotlight. And that's why I think I was a theater major for a long time. But so I wanted to have these characters tell their stories. And I kept running up against that old thing that I've got, which is, they're talking too much and people aren't going to read it. And so I finally decided that they would naturally, in the telling and the push-pull and the inherent conflicts of telling their stories, they would realize, why don't we break down the telling of our stories? And so they decided to break it down to, like, first of all, creating the space for you to tell your story. Like, who does that? But if you're on a retreat, you might as well. That's why you're there. So so they decided to do it break it into two parts, which is what was supposed to happen and then what actually happened. And if they're there with this big, huge conflict in their lives to figure out what goes next in their, the next chapter of their lives, something tells me that those two weren't one and the same, what was supposed to happen and then what actually happened. And so once we got into that, then everything opened up. Then there was movement. This is like the first 100 pages of the book. And I thought I was just going to get reamed by critics and readers. Instead, people say to me, I loved the dialogue, loved that they actually showed up for this time together and they told stories, whether they resisted it or not. So it triggered a lot of stuff for me in that way. But it also really helped me to understand that we need to talk. We all need to tell our stories. And if you want to break it into what was supposed to happen and what actually happened, it's really helpful. So I actually did it for myself. In writing the book, and it like doors blew open. So I recommend it to anybody who's out there. Yeah, it was really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're getting at is that the writing experience, you really do place yourself in the space where you've put your characters, and you're kind of observing them or interacting with them, and certainly you're listening to them as they start to become more real. So I think that's it's a very intense experience to spend that kind of time with your characters.
And it's a perfect place to ask me the next question, Julie, which is, for me, your memoir incorporates some fictional devices. Why did you choose to do this? And what was that experience like for you as a memoirist? I mean, this was my favorite part of the book. I was fascinated by everything in the book, but I was so fascinated as somebody who loves memoir and fiction about the fictional parts. So talk to us about the why and the how of that.
Yeah. So the situation, I was a dogged researcher, and I really went after every possible trail I possibly could. And then I found that I'd hit a wall, and the wall was that the people whom I would have liked to have asked, who were there in the room, so to speak, were no longer here. And so I spent a lot of time thinking that maybe, in fact, I had to turn this entire project into a novel. But then I thought that the story of that the sort of braided narrative of my researching and making my trips back to Europe to uncover all the stories of my family, that maybe there was another way through it. And that if I sort of chose to be, let's say, a bit speculative, to write speculative scenes, but I knew if I told my reader, this is what I'm going to do, please come with me, bear with me while I do this. And also that I knew that my scenes were plausible, that they were based on research, that I could take my reader into scenes that would, if I pull it off, they'll really get some of the sort of sensory experience of the places that I'm describing and the time period that maybe no other type of narrative would be able to create. So I remember when it happened, when I sort of made this decision that this is what I was going to do, I wrote to my editor and said, I'm going to try this thing, and you'll tell me if I'm really messing it up, and won't you? You'll tell me. And he said, of course. And I started with this one section. I sent it to him, and he liked it, so I kept on going. So it's very, I would say it's like the pepper of the seasoning in the story, that it's not everywhere, but where I placed it was really where I felt that there wasn't any other way. There was no other way through except to use my imagination.
And what I loved about that is that it showed us a lot about you, because you're our protagonist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it showed you empathizing with these people. And it gave us permission to imagine, okay, I've got this picture of my homesteader family, or I've got a book, I've got all my grandmother's dancing cards. And it's just like,
wow,
who is she? Who was she? And of course, we're going to fill in holes. But the process of going on the pilgrimage, really, that Julie went on, is one of empathy. And so to me, that's what I loved about the fiction, because while it helped me to fill in those holes and imagine their world, it really showed me how this research that this journey is overused, I think. Although I like it though, but I like this. To me, your book is a pilgrimage. In taking this pilgrimage, when we get into the fictional stuff, which is sort of in the third act of the book, we see how it's changing you.
Mm-hmm.
And you're the one that we're rooting for. You're the one that we care about most of all.
Mm-hmm.
And so I loved that. It was a device, but it didn't feel divisive. So I loved it. I loved it so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm like an Outlander addict. I finished it. But I'll go back and watch the whole thing again. But empathy, the act of writing memoir or fiction, any kind of writing, is really about the act of empathy.
Yeah,
I felt it really strong.
And it was tricky because, as I mentioned, I'd had a difficult relationship with my mother at times. There was a lot of conflict, and I really felt I really had a really desperate need to understand who she had been. After she died, I was really shocked by the loss and how it hit me hard, and it made me feel that this was really the only way to kind of understand what made her the way she was, and how sort of history makes all of us in that way. We're all touched by history. So it's
yeah.
So
we have 7 more minutes.
I
think Julie and I are just going to talk all the way up to the top, because we each have one more question for one another.
Well, we'll carry on if that's. Okay.
Let's do it. We can paraphrase our answers to the next ones, because I know that Annie is eager to come back in, and maybe if there are any Q&A that we can address. But so let's do our last questions, and we'll just be expeditious about them.
Yes,
how about that?
we will. So I was hoping you would talk a little bit about what happens at your Haven retreats. And, I know that maybe that was the inspiration for sort of the setting and the idea of women coming together. And I was wondering if you could just talk about some of the encounters that you've had with the people who've come to Haven, and that have sort of come to this temporary safe place that you've made.
I love that question, especially from you, because I know you've done McDowell and Yadu, and you understand what happens. Now with Haven, it's not that you go someplace and you write and then you have communal meals. It's that, but you also have about 7 hours of class a day. And so it's really intense, and it all happens in Montana, and people are at all really different stages of their writing pilgrimage path. And I am starting it up again in September. I've got one September 8th through 12. I've got one September 15 through 19 and one October 27 through 31. They're filling really fast because people are starved for this.
Can imagine.
And but what I love about it the most is that I stand outside of the barn and we're on 1 square mile of this gorgeous ranch looking into the peaks of Glacier National Park. And these people don't know each other. And they've all signed up for this after a rigorous conversation with me on the phone to make sure it's a good match. And I listen right before I go in. And it's, people who write and go on retreats, they're not extroverts usually. And it sounds like some sort of a reunion. In fact, one woman said, "This is the best family reunion I've never been on."
Yeah.
And so I just it's like magic, and it's not me, it's the place, it's the people who come, but it's also, I think, the design of the program. And on top of that, it's really just what happens when you like take that free fall out of your comfort zone and you step outside of good and bad and right and wrong and great at the end and the big one, perfection. And I've got this one big time and free fall into this free zone, and I'm holding the net. I've worked with over 1,000 people. So every time I'm kind of new when I do this, and and what they always say is, we're your best group. There's no way this could happen again.
Yeah.
And I just break the news to them that it's like that every single time for 9 years, over 1,000 people. It's like that.
Yeah.
And so that, I mean, you can imagine why I wanted to write Willa's Grove, because it was like, what is that magic? That morning that I was sitting on the side of my bed thinking, how can I capture this in a novel without it being about a writing retreat? And I think I did it. It took me a while. 19 drafts again, but I think I captured what happens when we leave home to, as the poet Emma Mellon says, spell ourselves differently. And it's not that I'm not advocating for people to step away from their support systems, family and friends in their daily lives. I'm just saying that I know that something happens when you leave. And then when you can, again, bridge to your own self-awareness, then you can more powerfully and authentically bridge back to who you are in your normal life.
I think that's sometimes you just have to take yourself away. Sometimes it doesn't have to be for very long, but you just take yourself out and then you can put yourself back in that place, and you feel you have different energy for your life, and you can, I think that's so important. So, yeah.
I agree. Okay, I got your last question, and we've sort of.
Do we have time? I guess we do.
We have 2 more minutes.
Okay.
I mean, I think we've already touched on some of it, but I think it's also important. Structure is the hardest thing about writing a book in any genre. And I know this well because not only have I written a bunch of books, but I also have helped a lot of people with their books. And your memoir is a braided narrative that weaves you as a researcher and your family's history as you discovered it. So I'm just curious, we've touched on this, but maybe you could just nuance this a little bit for us. How did this structure evolve as a way of telling the story?
So, like all good things that happen in at least in my creative life, I'll just say personally, I'm always waiting for accidents to happen. So in my case, I started out, I was writing a memoir. It was told in the past tense, and I was gonna just work through the history. And then I guess for me, what happened is that because it took a long time to do, and the rest of my life was happening, and I started noticing how the rest of my life and how connected it was to the story I was trying to tell. So then it became clear that I had to become part of the story. I sort of resisted it, but it became evident that I was going to have to make an appearance. And so in the end, what I felt was that let me be honest, again, very honest with my reader, and say, I'm living my life, and I'm going to take you on this journey to the past, and I'm going to even show you how I got there. And you'll come with me while I do my research and meet all these people. One historian, in fact, that I interviewed, I told him, by the way, you're going to be in the book, because we had lunch together in Vienna. And I said, you're gonna be in the book. And he said, oh, really? But because I think that kind of, he would be more used to being a source, but not being a character. And I said, well, yeah, because, we're doing this thing together. We're living this in the present. We're communicating it in the present. So it did, I will say the structure evolved over a long period of time. I tried it many different ways. I'm sure you're familiar with your work as well. You try it one way, you try another way. It's almost like pieces of a puzzle that are coming together, and you just have to find the best way to tell your narrative. Yeah,
that's right. And just in closing, and then Annie, you can beam back in, but I'm looking over in the chat, and that's perfect that you just said that, because there's a woman, Shannon, who's asking us to talk about our writing processes. I kind of feel like that's what you just did. And I will say to you that if you're interested in writing, find a writing practice that works for you, not anyone else. Don't read it in a book. It's not prescriptive. It's based on your personality, your responsibilities, your habits. When the creative flow happens, I've always said to people that I've created flexible children, and as well, I've created a flexible writer in myself. Be kind to yourself. Have it be like you're a little child getting away with, like, I think of it like butterflies in my stomach, like, ooh, I'm going to pretend I'm sick so I can stay home and write. It should be delightful. It should be delightful. And especially if you're writing about hard stuff, and know that you're in the flow, when you lose track of time, please eat, please take walks, please move your body around. But that when you lose track of time, you're in that meditative waking trance. That's when you're in your voice. That's when you're in your flow, and pay attention to it.
Yeah.
So
I agree.
Annie, I think it's time.
Yeah.
Come on back.
Hi.
We are 1 minute ahead. So
well, I'm glad you saw Shannon's question, because that's great. Sounds like you kind of handled that. So Shannon, I hope that was helpful to you, and thank you for watching. Thank you also to Judy and Pamela for your kind words. Thanks for being here. So I just want to reiterate that the books are available at majorsandquinn.com. Willa's Grove is currently available, so I put that link in the comments here. And then Ava is available soon, so you can just check our website in the coming weeks. It should hit the shelves soon. The official publication date is April 6th. And you could also call Majors and Quinn at 612-822-4611 to pre-order over the phone if you are interested. So thank you again for tuning in. Thank you both of you for this wonderful, wonderful conversation.
Thank you for having us.
He talked earlier, so people could see him. And I hope that those of you who tuned in will see you soon at another virtual event. Thanks so much, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much.